I smoothed the wrapping paper with trembling fingers. The sound was crisp in the sudden silence of my son's living room. The envelope beneath felt thin, almost weightless, and something cold settled in my stomach before I even opened it. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. Go ahead, Mom, Walt said from across the room. His arm draped possessively around Danielle's shoulders. At 62, I had learned to read the spaces between words, the pauses that spoke louder than any declaration. His voice carried that forced brightness I'd grown to despise. The tone he used when he wanted to appear generous while delivering something that wasn't. Danielle adjusted her new diamond bracelet, the one Walt had presented to her with such ceremony just minutes before. $30,000 he'd announced proudly for her dream trip to Italy. Her mother, Mary, had squealed with delight from her chair by the fireplace, already planning which museums to visit first, which restaurants to try. The Christmas tree lights caught the facets of Danielle's gift, throwing tiny rainbows across her satisfied smile. I tore open the envelope. "Peaceful Pines Motel," I read aloud, my voice steady despite the earthquake building in my chest. One night, executive suite, and the voucher was printed on cheap paper, the kind they use for promotional materials. The motel's logo featured a cartoon pine tree wearing sunglasses. I'd driven past Peaceful Pines countless times. It squatted beside the interstate like a concrete afterthought, the kind of place that charged by the hour and asked no questions. "It's just for one night, but we thought you might enjoy some time to yourself," Danielle said, her voice dripping with manufactured sweetness. "You're always saying how tired you are." I looked up at my son, my only child. The boy I'd raised alone after his father died when Walt was 12. The boy I'd worked double shifts for, scraping together money for his college tuition while I deferred my own dreams. The man who now made more in a month than I'd ever seen in a year, who lived in this glass monument to success while I rented a studio apartment above Mrs. Hopkins's restaurant. "Time to myself," I repeated. "Exactly." Walt's enthusiasm felt rehearsed. "You deserve a break, Mom. You've been working so hard at the nursing home." I folded the voucher carefully, my movements deliberate. Around us, the Christmas morning tableau continued. Walt's two children, Laura and Stephen, aged 8 and 6, were absorbed in their new tablets, their fingers swiping across screens worth more than my monthly rent. Danielle's teenage daughter from her first marriage, Catherine, modeled her new designer purse, taking selfies by the towering Christmas tree that probably cost more than my car. "A break," I said, testing the words. At Peaceful Pines, something flickered in Walt's eyes. Guilt, perhaps, or irritation that I wasn't performing proper gratitude. "It has great reviews online." I thought of the years I'd dreamed of Italy, the travel magazines I'd collected since I was 16, the Italian phrase book I'd bought 3 decades ago and still kept beside my bed. I thought of the conversations I'd had with Walt about those dreams, how his eyes would glaze over when I mentioned the Colosseum or the canals of Venice, how he'd always change the subject to Danielle's latest redecorating project or his mother-in-law's various ailments. "I'm sure it does." I slipped the voucher into my purse alongside my car keys and the credit card I barely used. "Thank you both." "This is very thoughtful," Danielle beamed, clearly missing the ice in my tone. "We just want you to be happy, Scarlett. Family is so important. Family." The words sat heavy in my mouth like a communion wafer that refused to dissolve. I looked around the room again at the enormous presents, the expensive decorations, the catered brunch that would feed a small village. Everything carefully curated to project success, happiness, the American dream realized. Everything except a place for me in it. "Well," I said, standing and smoothing my modest dress, the one I'd bought on sale at Kmart 3 years ago and only wore to special occasions. "I should probably head over to the motel before they give away my room." Walt frowned. "Now, but we haven't had brunch yet." Danielle made well. She had catered. "I wouldn't want to waste the gift," I said evenly. "A whole night to myself. I should make the most of it." I kissed each of the children goodbye, their faces sticky with chocolate from expensive candy. Laura looked up from her tablet long enough to say, "Bye, Grandma," before returning to her game. Stephen didn't look up at all. In the marble foyer, I paused to look at the family portrait hanging beside the door. Walt, Danielle, and the children, all professional smiles and coordinated outfits. I wasn't in it, of course. Danielle had explained that it was just for the immediate family, and I'd nodded and smiled as I always did. The cold December air hit my face like a slap as I walked to my 12-year-old Honda. Behind me, I could hear the sounds of Christmas continuing, laughter, the clink of expensive champagne glasses, music that didn't include me. I sat in my car for a long moment, hands on the steering wheel, watching my breath fog the windows. The voucher lay on the passenger seat beside my purse, mocking me with its cheerful cartoon pine tree. 30,000 for Italy. One night at Peaceful Pines, for the woman who had given up everything to ensure her son could live this life. I thought about the nursing home where I worked, the residents I cared for who had been abandoned by their own children. How I'd always told myself my situation was different, that Walt loved me. He was just busy, just focused on his own family. How I'd made excuses for the forgotten birthdays, the missed calls, the gradual erosion of my place in his life. My phone buzzed. A text from Danielle. Drive safe. The motel has a hot tub. Treat yourself. I stared at the message for a long time, memorizing the casual cruelty of it. Then I turned off my phone. The Honda's engine coughed to life, and I pulled out of the circular driveway, past the mailbox with the Barnes family, etched in elegant script. I drove slowly through their neighborhood of perfect lawns and perfect families, each house a fortress of success and contentment. At the stop sign, I could turn right toward Peaceful Pines and my gift of solitude. Or I could turn left toward downtown, toward decisions I wasn't ready to name. I sat at that intersection for what felt like hours, though it was probably only minutes. Behind me, Christmas continued in the house where I was no longer welcome. Ahead of me stretched choices I'd been too afraid to make for too long. Finally, I turned the wheel. I turned left. The downtown district stretched before me, mostly empty on Christmas morning. Shop windows displayed their holiday finery to vacant sidewalks, and traffic lights cycled through their colors for an audience of one. My Honda hummed steadily as I drove with no destination in mind, just away from the perfect suburban tableau, where I'd finally understood my true place. The motel voucher lay forgotten on the passenger seat, while something harder than anger crystallized in my chest. This wasn't rage. Rage was hot, impulsive, something that burned bright and fast. This was colder, more deliberate. This was clarity. My phone, still turned off, felt heavy in my purse. I pulled into the empty parking lot of a closed coffee shop and sat there, engine running, heat blasting against the December chill. The silence felt immense after the forced merriment of Walt's house. I thought about switching the phone back on, calling my son, explaining how his gift had made me feel. I could already script the conversation. His defensive protestations, Danielle's wounded innocence, the inevitable guilt trip about how difficult I was being, how I should be grateful for any gesture at all. Instead, I reached for the glove compartment and pulled out a business card I'd carried for 3 years, but never used. The edges were worn from handling, but the gold lettering was still clear. Scott Hopkins, International Investment Solutions. Below it, handwritten in careful script, for Scarlett, call me when you're ready for that adventure. M. Scott. I hadn't thought about him in months, but holding his card brought back that autumn afternoon 3 years ago. I'd been volunteering at the hospital's international outreach program, helping elderly immigrants navigate the healthcare system. Scott had been there visiting his grandmother, this elegant man in his early 60s with kind eyes and an expensive watch he tried to hide beneath his shirt cuffs. We'd talked while waiting for his grandmother's appointment, about travel, about dreams deferred, about the children who grew up in a way. He'd mentioned his work, something about helping people invest their money wisely, build the futures they'd always imagined. When his grandmother emerged from her appointment, he'd pressed his card into my hand. I help people make their dreams come true, he'd said simply. When you're ready. I'd laughed it off then. I was just a nursing home aide with $200 in savings and dreams too expensive for my reality. But I'd kept his card. Now, sitting in this empty parking lot with a motel voucher as my Christmas gift, I turned my phone back on. It immediately buzzed with messages. 3 from Danielle, all variations of, hope you're enjoying your me time. 2 from Walt about forgetting something at their house. 1 from Catherine asking if I wanted to see her new purse in better lighting. I deleted them all without reading them completely and dialed Scott's number. He answered on the second ring, his voice warm despite the early hour. Scarlett, is that you? Yes, it's me. I surprised myself with how steady I sounded. I hope I'm not interrupting Christmas morning. Not at all. I was just making coffee and thinking about my grandmother's stories of Christmas in Shanghai. She always said the best gifts came when you least expected them. There was a pause, and I could hear the smile in his voice. Are you ready for that adventure we talked about? I looked down at the motel voucher, then at my reflection in the rearview mirror. 62 years old, wearing my good dress and careful makeup, sitting alone in a parking lot on Christmas morning because my own son had essentially given me a gift certificate for exile. I have won $200 in savings, I said. And I'm tired of being small. $200 is more than enough to start, Scott said, his voice growing more focused. But before we talk money, tell me what you really want, Scarlett. Not what you think you can afford, what you actually want. The question hit me like cold water. When was the last time someone had asked me what I wanted? Not what would be practical, not what would be appropriate for someone in my position, not what would be convenient for everyone else, just what I wanted. Italy, I said without hesitation. I've dreamed about Italy since I was 16. I want to see the Colosseum, eat real pasta in Rome, watch the sunset over the canals in Venice. I want to feel like I'm living, not just existing. Italy is beautiful, Scott said quietly. I lived in Milan for 2 years. The light there, it changes you. I know it sounds impossible. Stop! His voice was gentle but firm. Nothing is impossible, Scarlett. It's just a matter of understanding how to make it happen. Can you meet me today? I know it's Christmas, but I think this conversation is more important than any traditional holiday. I thought about returning to my studio apartment, spending Christmas night alone with leftover Chinese takeout and my Italian phrase book. I thought about the motel voucher and Walt's satisfied smile when he'd handed it to me. Where? I asked. There's a small cafe downtown, Florence's. The owner is a friend of mine. She keeps it open for people who don't have anywhere else to go on holidays. She makes the best espresso outside of Italy. An hour later, I sat across from Scott in a cozy cafe that smelled like cinnamon and hope. The other patrons were an eclectic mix. A few elderly people who lived alone, a young couple who seemed to be escaping family obligations, an artist sketching in the corner. Everyone looked like they'd chosen to be there rather than being exiled. Scott had aged well in the 3 years since I'd seen him. His hair was more silver now, but his eyes held the same warmth, the same careful attention that had made me keep his card. He wore jeans and a simple sweater, expensive I could tell but understated. Not like Walt's aggressive displays of wealth. Tell me about your Christmas morning, he said, stirring sugar into his espresso. I found myself telling him everything. The $30,000 trip to Italy for Danielle's mother. The motel voucher. The family portrait in the foyer where I didn't exist. The gradual realization that I'd become a burden to be managed rather than a person to be loved. Scott listened without interrupting, occasionally nodding, his expression growing more serious as I spoke. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. How much do you think your son spent on Christmas this year? He asked finally. I thought about the gifts, the catered brunch, the decorations. Maybe $50,000 more. And he gave you a night at Peaceful Pines. I know how it sounds. It sounds like you've been accepting crumbs for so long that you forgot you deserved a seat at the table. Scott leaned forward, his voice intent. Scarlett, I've built my career helping people who thought they couldn't afford their dreams. Most of them were wrong. They just didn't know how to think strategically. He pulled out a tablet and began showing me numbers, charts, projections. My $200 carefully invested could grow. He talked about risk tolerance, about compound interest, about opportunities I'd never considered. But more than that, he talked about a different way of thinking about money, not as something to hoard out of fear, but as a tool to build the life I actually wanted. This would take time, he said. Maybe 2 years to build enough for the Italy trip you're dreaming of. But in the meantime, there are smaller adventures. Weekend trips, a cooking class, Italian language lessons, ways to start living instead of just surviving. I stared at the numbers on his screen, at projections that showed my small savings growing into something significant. It felt impossible and inevitable at the same time. Why are you helping me? I asked. Scott smiled, and for a moment he looked younger. My grandmother came to America with $50 in a suitcase. She worked in factories for 40 years, sent money back to China, raised 5 children. When she was 70, she told me she'd saved enough to take one trip back to see her village. Just one trip after 40 years of sacrifice. He paused, looking out the window at the empty street. She died 2 weeks before she was supposed to leave. Heart attack at the grocery store. The money she'd saved so carefully for that one dream just sat in her bank account. Her children inherited it, of course. But the dream died with her. "I'm sorry," I whispered. "Don't be sorry. Be smarter than she was. She thought she had to earn the right to live. That sacrifice was more virtuous than joy. I learned from watching her that dreams deferred are dreams denied." He looked back at me, his eyes serious. "You've spent your adult life sacrificing for other people. What if you spent the rest of it living for yourself?" The question hung between us like a challenge. Outside, snow had begun to fall, dusting the empty street with possibility. My phone buzzed again. Probably Walt, wondering where I was, whether I'd made it safely to my exile at Peaceful Pines. I turned the phone face down without looking at it. "If we do this," I said slowly, "if I really commit to this, it changes everything with Walt, with my whole life." "Yes," Scott said simply, "it does." The weight of that truth settled over me like the snow outside. Cold at first, then strangely warming. For 62 years, I'd shaped my life around other people's needs, other people's comfort. The obedient daughter, the devoted mother, the convenient grandmother who asked for nothing and received exactly that. What would happen if I stopped being convenient? What would happen if I started being powerful instead? I signed the investment papers 3 days after Christmas, sitting in Scott's downtown office while snow continued to fall outside. The building was mostly empty during the holiday week, our footsteps echoing in marble hallways that smelled of money and possibility. Scott's office occupied a corner on the 15th floor with windows that looked out over the city like a promise. "This is just the beginning," he said, watching me initial each page with careful precision. "The money will grow, but that's not the real investment we're making." "What do you mean?" He leaned back in his leather chair, considering his words. "We're investing in a different version of you. The woman who makes her own choices instead of accepting whatever she's given. That's worth more than any portfolio." My phone had been buzzing intermittently all morning. Walt calling, Danielle texting, even a few messages from Mary about how much she was looking forward to Italy. I'd stopped answering after the first day. Let them wonder where I was, what I was doing. For once, my absence was creating questions instead of relief. "What about your family?" Scott asked, nodding toward my phone. "They're going to notice you've changed." "I hope so," I said, surprising myself with the steel in my voice. "I've been invisible for so long. I'm curious what happens when I become inconvenient." That afternoon, I did something I hadn't done in 20 years. I spent money on myself without permission or apology. Not much, just $200 at a small boutique Scott had recommended. But as I tried on clothes that actually fit, that made me look like a woman instead of a collection of apologies. Something fundamental shifted. The saleswoman, Gina, was maybe 45, with graying hair she wore like a crown, and the kind of confidence that comes from knowing exactly who you are. She studied me with the focused attention of an artist. "You're not shopping for who you are," she observed, watching me hesitate over a deep blue sweater that brought out my eyes. "You're shopping for who you think you're allowed to be." "I don't know the difference anymore," I admitted. Gina smiled and pulled the sweater from my hands. "Try this on because you love it, not because it's practical or appropriate or what someone else expects, just because it makes you feel beautiful." In the dressing room mirror, I saw someone I'd forgotten existed. The woman in the blue sweater stood straighter, smiled more easily. She looked like someone who might have dreams that mattered. I bought the sweater and a pair of earrings that caught the light. Walking out of that store, I felt like I was carrying secrets. That evening, I sat in my studio apartment and really looked at it for the first time in years. The tired furniture I'd bought secondhand when Walt was in college. The stack of Italian travel magazines I'd hidden like pornography, as if dreaming too openly was somehow shameful. The small television, where I watched other people live, the lives I'd convinced myself were too extravagant for someone like me. It looked like the apartment of someone who was waiting for her real life to begin. I poured myself a glass of the wine Scott had given me, a Chianti from Tuscany that tasted like sunshine and possibility, and opened my laptop. For the first time in 3 years, I logged into my dormant social media account. The last post was from Walt's wedding to Danielle, where I'd shared a photo of the happy couple with some generic congratulations. Before that, scattered pictures of my grandchildren, carefully curated moments from a life that existed on the periphery of other people's happiness. I stared at the blank status update box for a long time, cursor blinking like a heartbeat. Then I began to type, starting a new chapter at 62. Sometimes the best gifts are the ones that show you who you really are. Italy, 2025. Dream deferred. I attached a photo of my new sweater laid out on my bed, the Italian phrase book beside it, and hit post before I could lose my nerve. Within an hour, the comments started coming. Old colleagues from the hospital, neighbors, even some high school friends I'd lost touch with decades ago. Everyone seemed surprised to hear from me, as if I'd returned from the dead. Their enthusiasm felt foreign after years of being treated like an afterthought. "Scarlett, I had no idea you were planning a trip to Italy. You look amazing in that color. I've always wanted to go to Italy too. Maybe we could plan something together." But it was the silence from Walt and Danielle that spoke loudest. I could picture them seeing the post, the uncomfortable questions it raised. Where had I gotten? Money for new clothes? What did I mean by Italy 2025? Who was this version of their mother-in-law who posted photos and made plans without consulting them? The phone rang at 9:00 M's Walt. I let it go to voicemail. He called again at 9:30, then 10, then Danielle tried, then Walt again. I turned off the phone and ran a hot bath, something else I'd forgotten I enjoyed. As I soaked in water that smelled like the lavender, soap I'd splurged on at the boutique, I thought about the messages accumulating on my silenced phone, the demands for explanations, the wounded confusion, the slow realization that I was no longer performing the role they'd written for me. The next morning, Scott called from his office line while I was making coffee with beans I'd bought from a shop that roasted them fresh instead of the instant crystals I'd been drinking for years. "I saw your post," he said, and I could hear the approval in his voice. "How does it feel to exist in public?" "Terrifying," I admitted, "and wonderful. I keep expecting someone to tell me to take it down, to stop being so visible." And if they did, I thought about it, sipping coffee that actually tasted like something worth drinking. I'd tell them, "No, good, because I have a proposition for you." A client of mine runs cultural tours to Italy, small groups, art history focused. He's putting together a trip for next December, and he needs someone with your background to help with the older participants. Someone who understands healthcare, who can provide assistance if needed. My heart stopped. I mean you could work your way to Italy, not as a tourist spending money you're worried about, but as someone providing a valuable service. The position pays enough to cover your expenses, plus a small stipend, and you'd have access to private tours, expert guides, experiences most tourists never see. I set down my coffee cup with shaking hands. "Scott, I don't have any qualifications for something like that. I'm just a nursing home aide. You're a healthcare professional with 30 years of experience caring for elderly people. You speak some Italian, you understand medical needs, and you have the kind of steady competence that comes from real experience. That's exactly what they need. The possibility hung before me like a door I'd never imagined could open. Not just Italy. Italy while doing meaningful work, using skills I'd developed over decades of caring for others. Not charity, not a handout, but an opportunity I'd earned through my own experience. What would I need to do? Meet with Ricky, that's the tour operator. Show him you're serious, that you understand the responsibility. The job starts with a 6-month training period, learning about the destinations, the culture, and basic travel medicine. You'd be working while you prepare for the trip of your dreams. After we hung up, I sat in my small kitchen for a long time, watching the morning light stream through windows I'd forgotten to notice. My phone lay silent on the counter. Still, turned off, still accumulating messages from a family that was finally discovering I had boundaries. I thought about Walt's surprise when he realized I wasn't at Peaceful Pines, wasn't answering his calls, and wasn't performing gratitude for their Christmas crumb. I thought about Danielle's confusion when she saw my post, the uncomfortable questions it must have raised about the woman they'd dismissed so casually. Most of all, I thought about the look Mary would have when she discovered that the woman they'd given a motel voucher to was planning her own trip to Italy. Not as a desperate afterthought, but as someone with purpose, with value, with her own dreams that didn't require anyone's permission. I turned my phone back on. 17 missed calls, 23 text messages, 1 voicemail from Walt that started with, "Mom, what the hell?" before I deleted it. The most recent text was from Danielle, sent an hour ago. "Scarlett, we're worried about you. Please call. We need to talk about this Italy thing. It's not realistic for someone in your position." Someone in my position. I looked around my apartment, at the Italian books, at the new sweater hanging in my closet, at the investment papers Scott had given me copies of, and at the email notification on my laptop from Ricky's travel company asking when I'd be available for an interview. I opened a new text message to Danielle and Walt both. "I'm fine, very busy these days. We'll call when I have time." Then I added, "Thank you for the Christmas gift." It showed me exactly what I needed to see. I hit send before I could edit. Myself, before I could soften the edges or add explanations or apologies. The message sat there on the screen, stark and uncompromising, while my heart hammered against my ribs. For the first time in my adult life, I had told my son and his wife exactly what I thought, without cushioning the blow. I had refused to make myself smaller to make them more comfortable. The phone immediately started buzzing with calls. I turned it off again and made myself another cup of the good coffee. Outside, the snow was melting, revealing patches of ground that had been hidden all winter. Spring was still months away, but something in the light had changed, something that looked like the beginning of a season I'd been waiting for my entire life. The interview with Ricky took place 2 weeks later in a small restaurant that specialized in authentic Tuscan cuisine. I'd spent the intervening days in a strange bubble of productivity, studying Italian with an intensity I hadn't applied to anything since nursing school, researching art history, and practicing conversations with Scott about travel logistics and elderly care protocols. Walt had stopped calling after the first week, but Danielle's messages had become increasingly frantic. The latest one, which I'd read but not answered, began with, "Scarlett, we're very concerned about your mental state." My mental state had never been clearer. Ricky Schnapp was nothing like I'd expected. Where I'd imagined someone slick and sales-focused, he was gentle and scholarly, with paint-stained fingers and the kind of passionate intensity that comes from loving your work. He'd grown up in Florence, studied art history at Bologna, and spoke about Italy the way other people talked about their children. "Scott tells me you dream of Italy," he said over plates of handmade pasta that tasted like everything I'd imagined Italian food could be. But dreams are easy. This work is not easy. These are elderly people often traveling without their families, often dealing with health issues, mobility problems, fear of being away from home. You become their anchor, their security, sometimes their only friend for 2 weeks. "I've been doing that work for 30 years, I said, "just in different circumstances." "Yes, but this is different. In a nursing home, the residents are contained, predictable. On a tour, you have people trying to navigate cobblestones with walkers, having medication reactions to different food, becoming overwhelmed by sensory overload, getting lost in crowds. You have to be a diplomat, nurse, translator, and sometimes family all at once." The more he talked, the more certain I became that this was exactly what I wanted to do. Not just to get to Italy, but to use decades of accumulated skills in service of something meaningful, to help other people experience wonder instead of simply managing their decline. "Tell me about your family," Ricky said as we shared tiramisu that made me understand why people wrote poetry about food. They must be excited about this opportunity. The question hit like cold water. I set down my fork and considered how to answer without sounding pathetic or bitter. "My family doesn't know yet," I said finally. "They're adjusting to the idea that I have ambitions beyond being conveniently available." Ricky's dark eyes sharpened with understanding. "Ah, they prefer you small. They prefer me grateful. And you are no longer grateful." I thought about Christmas morning, about the motel voucher, about $30,000 for Danielle's mother and cartoon pine trees for me, about the family portrait where I didn't exist, and the gradual erosion of my place in my son's life. "I'm grateful for the lesson," I said, "just not to them." Ricky smiled, the first genuine warmth I'd seen from him all evening. Good. People who are too grateful make poor advocates for travelers who need someone strong in their corner. "When can you start training?" We shook hands outside the restaurant, and I felt something click into place that had been misaligned for years. Purpose, direction, a future that belonged to me instead of being allocated by committee. Walking to my car, I turned my phone back on for the first time in days. 47 missed calls, 62 text messages, 3 voicemails. The most recent message was from Walt, sent an hour ago. "Mom, this has gone on long enough. Danielle and I are coming over tomorrow evening. We need to discuss this Italy situation and your recent behavior. 7 p.m., not asking, telling." I stared at the message for a long time, feeling something shift in my chest, like tectonic plates finding a new alignment. For 30 years, I'd arranged my life around Walt's schedule, Walt's convenience, Walt's comfort. I'd accepted his pronouncements about what we needed to discuss and when we needed to discuss it. Tomorrow evening, I had Italian language lessons with Mrs. Robinson from the community center, followed by dinner with Scott to discuss the European investment accounts he was setting up for me. I typed back, "I'm not available tomorrow evening or any evening until you learn to ask instead of demand. When you're ready to have a conversation, instead of delivering an ultimatum, let me know." I hit send and immediately turned the phone off again, my hands shaking with adrenaline. At home, I opened a bottle of the Brunello Scott had recommended, something I would have considered ridiculously extravagant 6 months ago, and sat down to write my first travel blog post. Ricky had suggested it as part of my training, a way to practice describing experiences for people who weren't there. I wrote about the restaurant, about Ricky's paint-stained fingers, about tasting real tiramisu for the first time. But mostly I wrote about the feeling of sitting across from someone who saw me as capable, who spoke to me about challenges instead of limitations, who assumed I could handle complexity instead of protecting me from it. When I finished writing, I posted it to my social media along with a photo of the empty tiramisu plate and Ricky's business card. Within minutes, the likes and comments started flowing. Old friends excited about my adventure, acquaintances asking for travel recommendations, even a few strangers who'd found my posts through mutual connections. The response was intoxicating. After years of invisibility, of being the person others forgot to invite or include, I was suddenly someone with interesting news, with plans worth envying. My phone, still turned off, sat silent on the counter like a judgment I was no longer willing to accept. The next evening, I was conjugating Italian verbs with Mrs. Robinson when I saw Walt's car pull up outside the community center. Through the window, I watched him sit in his BMW for nearly 10 minutes, probably calling my apartment, maybe driving past Scott's office, searching for the woman who had stopped organizing her life around his expectations. Mrs. Robinson, following my gaze, made a disapproving sound. "Ex-husband?" she asked in her careful English. "Son," I said. She studied Walt through the window. His expensive coat, his obvious agitation, the way he kept checking his phone. "He looks like he is used to getting his way." "He is." "And you are changing this?" "Yes." I looked down at my Italian workbook, at the conjugations I was learning so I could help elderly tourists navigate Rome and Florence, at the life I was building one careful decision at a time. "Yes," I said, "I am changing this." Walt eventually drove away, but not before sitting in his car for another 20 minutes, probably sending increasingly frustrated messages to my silent phone. Over dinner, Scott listened to my account of the afternoon with the focused attention I'd grown to treasure. Unlike Walt, who had always responded to my stories with distracted nods or immediate advice about what I should do differently, Scott asked questions that helped me understand my own feelings. "How did it feel watching him wait for you?" He asked over glasses of wine that cost more than I used to spend on groceries in a week. Powerful, I admitted, and terrifying. For 30 years, if Walt called, I came running. If he needed something, I rearranged my life to provide it. Watching him sit there, unable to reach me, I paused, searching for the right words. It felt like the first time I ever said no and meant it. And how do you think he felt? The question was gentle, but it cut straight to the heart of my guilt. I'd been raised to prioritize other people's comfort over my own truth, to smooth over conflict even when I wasn't the one creating it. Confused, I said slowly, maybe angry. Definitely entitled to an explanation I'm not ready to give. Are you worried about losing him? The question hung in the air between us like smoke. Was I worried about losing Walt? Or was I finally admitting that I'd lost him years ago? That what remained was just the performance of a relationship that served his convenience more than any genuine connection. I'm worried about discovering that there's nothing left to lose, I said finally. Scott nodded, as if this were a reasonable fear rather than a devastating admission. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for someone is refuse to enable their worst impulses. Walt has spent years treating you like a convenience store, always open, never demanding, grateful for whatever loose change he throws your way. You're closing the store. That doesn't make you cruel. It makes you sane. When I got home, I turned my phone on long enough to see the damage. 17 more calls. 31 more messages, including several from Danielle that had escalated from concerned to accusatory to something approaching panic. The last message, sent just an hour ago, was from Walt. Mom, whatever game you're playing needs to stop. You're embarrassing yourself and confusing the kids. Danielle's mother asked about your Italy posts, and we didn't know what to tell her. This isn't who you are. I read that message 3 times, each reading revealing new layers of assumption and dismissal. The idea that my choices were a game, the concern about embarrassment that had nothing to do with my well-being and everything to do with their image. The ultimate insult. This isn't who you are, as if they had the authority to define me. As if 30 years of managing their comfort had erased every other aspect of my identity. I typed back, "You're right. This isn't who I've been, but it's exactly who I'm becoming. The person I was, the one who accepted whatever you decided to give me. She was your creation, not mine. Meet the original." This time, I left the phone on, watching the dots appear and disappear as Walt started and stopped multiple responses. Finally, a single message appeared. "We need to talk. This has gone too far." I smiled and typed back, "Yes, we do. When you're ready to speak to me like an equal instead of managing me like a problem, I'll be here. Until then, I'm busy building a life that doesn't require your permission." The phone went silent after that. No more calls, no more messages. Outside my window, the city lights sparkled like a preview of the adventures waiting for me. Somewhere across the ocean, Italy slept under stars I would soon see with my own eyes. Not as a desperate tourist clutching at dreams, but as a professional with purpose, with value, with the kind of quiet confidence that comes from finally knowing your own worth. For the first time in decades, I fell asleep without wondering what Walt needed from me. Instead, I dreamed of cobblestone streets and the weight of my own footsteps carrying me exactly where I wanted to go. 8 months later, I stood on the terrace of a small hotel in Siena, watching the sunset paint the Tuscan hills in shades of gold that no photograph could capture. The tour group I'd been shepherding for the past 10 days was inside, sharing wine and stories over dinner, their voices drifting through the open windows like music. Mrs. Petit, 83 and traveling alone for the first time since her husband died, had finally stopped crying when she saw the Duomo. Mr. Hopkins had overcome his fear of crowds enough to haggle with vendors in the San Ricky market. The Thompson sisters had reconciled after a 60-year feud that started in this very city when they were young women chasing different boys. I'd helped facilitate all of it, using skills I'd developed over 3 decades of caring for people others had written off. But more than that, I'd witnessed it. I'd been present for moments of wonder that would have been impossible if I'd remained the woman who accepted motel vouchers as Christmas gifts. My phone buzzed with a message from Scott, who was back in the States managing my investments. The portfolio had grown beyond our most optimistic projections. Between the tour company salary, the investment returns, and the travel blog that had gained thousands of followers, I'd built something I'd never imagined possible: financial independence. But money was just the foundation. The real transformation was harder to quantify. I was scrolling through the comments on my latest blog post when I noticed a familiar name among the followers. Danielle Barnes had been reading my posts for months without saying anything, watching my adventures from the sidelines, like someone peering through curtains at a life she couldn't quite understand. The irony was exquisite. While she'd been planning her mother's $30,000 trip to Italy, a trip that had been postponed twice due to Mary's various health complaints, I'd been earning my way across Europe, building a career that let me see the world while helping others experience wonder. My phone rang. Walt was calling for the first time in 4 months. I almost let it go to voicemail, but something in the timing felt significant. I was strong enough now to hear whatever he had to say without losing myself in the conversation. "Hello, Walt." "Mom." His voice was different, smaller, less certain. "I saw your post from Siena, the one about Mrs. Petit in the cathedral." I waited, watching the light fade over the hills, letting him navigate whatever he'd called to say without helping him. "It was beautiful," he continued. "The way you wrote about her crying, about how she said she could feel her husband's presence there. I didn't know you could write like that. You never asked." The silence stretched between us, filled with the weight of all the conversations we'd never had, all the assumptions he'd made about who I was and what I wanted. "Danielle and I are getting divorced," he said finally. I felt a strange absence of satisfaction at the news. 6 months ago, it might have felt like justice. Now it just felt like information. "I'm sorry to hear that. Are you?" His voice carried a note of challenge, as if he were testing whether I'd pretend to feelings I didn't have. "I'm sorry that you're hurt," I said carefully. "I'm sorry that the children are going through this. I'm not sorry that you're both discovering what it feels like when someone decides you're no longer worth the effort." "Jesus, Mom!" But there was no anger in it, just exhaustion. "You really have changed." "Yes, I have." Another pause, longer this time. In the background, I could hear the tour group laughing at something Ricky had said. Their voices light with wine and the particular joy that comes from being somewhere beautiful with people who understand the gift of being alive. "The kids ask about you," Walt said. "Laura especially. She saw one of your posts about the gelato place in Rome and asked why Grandma was having adventures without us." The mention of Laura hit harder than I'd expected. I missed my grandchildren, missed being part of their daily lives. But I'd learned the difference between missing people and accepting whatever scraps of relationship they offered. "What did you tell her? That you were busy? That you'd found new friends?" He paused. "She asked if we made you sad, if that's why you went away." Out of the mouths of babes, Laura, at 9 years old, had grasped what her father had been unable to understand. That my absence wasn't arbitrary or vindictive, but a response to how I'd been treated. "What did you say to that?" I told her it was complicated. Walt's voice was thick with something that might have been regret. "But she's 9, Mom. She doesn't understand complicated. She just knows her grandmother used to be around all the time. And now she's in Italy, posting pictures of amazing food and smiling with strangers. Maybe that's not complicated at all," I said quietly. "Maybe that's exactly as simple as it sounds." I heard him take a shaky breath. "I know I messed up, Mom. The motel thing. God, when I think about that Christmas morning and the look on your face when you opened that envelope, I knew it was wrong, even as I was watching you try to pretend it was okay." "Then why did you do it?" The question I'd been carrying for 8 months finally spoken aloud. "Because it was easy," he said, his voice barely audible. "Because you always made everything easy for me. You never complained, never demanded anything, never made me think about what you might need or want." And Danielle kept pushing about her mother, about how much the Italy trip would mean to her. And it seemed like such a simple solution. Give Mary the big gesture. Give you something small so you didn't feel forgotten. Move on. Something small so I didn't feel forgotten. I know how it sounds now. I know it was messed up, but you have to understand. You've been the same my whole life. Stable, predictable, always there when I needed you. I didn't know you had dreams like this. I didn't know you wanted more." The admission hung between us like an autopsy of our relationship. He'd loved the convenience of me more than the complexity of me. He'd preferred me as a fixed point in his universe rather than as a person with my own orbit. "I told you about Italy," I said. "For years I told you about wanting to travel, about the books I read, the documentaries I watched. You heard it as background noise because it wasn't about you." You're right. The words came out flat, defeated. You're absolutely right, and I don't know how to fix it. Through the hotel window, I watched Ricky gesturing dramatically while telling a story about Michelangelo. His passion for his subject was infectious, even to people who'd never cared about art. This was what it looked like when someone saw you as capable of growth, of complexity, of surprise. Walt, I said, my voice gentle but firm, I don't need you to fix it. I need you to understand that it's already fixed. I fixed it by leaving, by building a life where I matter to myself and to other people, where my dreams aren't background noise. So that's it. We're done. The question was loaded with the expectation that I'd rush to reassure him, to soften the boundaries I'd spent months learning to maintain. The old Scarlet would have backpedaled, would have made herself smaller to ease his discomfort. We're done with the version of our relationship where you got to decide my worth, I said instead. If you want something different, something real, you're going to have to show me what that looks like. Not with grand gestures or apologies, but with consistent respect for who I actually am. How do I do that? I looked out over Siena, at the medieval towers catching the last light, at the ancient stones that had witnessed centuries of human drama. All those people, all those stories, all those moments of choosing between comfort and growth. You start by getting to know me, I said, the real me, not the convenient version you've been taking for granted, but the woman who learned Italian at 62, who guides tourists through museums, who has opinions about wine and art, and the best places to watch the sunset in Tuscany. You ask questions and listen to the answers. You stop assuming you know what I want and start discovering what I've become. And if I do that, would you consider coming home for a visit? The kids really do miss you, home. The word felt strange, loaded with assumptions that no longer applied. My home was wherever I chose to be. This hotel room in Siena, the apartment I kept in the States, the various cities where I'd lead tours over the coming months. Home was the feeling of belonging to my own life. I'll be back in the States for Christmas, I said. I'm leading a planning retreat for next year's tours. If you'd like to have dinner, if you'd like to have an actual conversation where you treat me like someone worth knowing, we can try that. Mom, his voice broke slightly. I love you. I know I've been lacking at showing it, but I do love you. I love you too, Walt, but I love myself now as well. And I won't go back to being someone I'm not just to make you comfortable with who you are. After we hung up, I sat on the terrace for a long time processing the conversation. It wasn't the dramatic confrontation I'd sometimes imagined with tears and recriminations and perfect speeches that would make him understand everything he'd put me through. It was quieter than that, more honest, the kind of conversation that happens when you've stopped needing other people's approval badly enough to perform for it. My blog post that night was about second chances, not the kind where you return to old patterns hoping for different results, but the kind where you become different enough to make new patterns possible. I wrote about the view from Siena's towers, about how distance changes perspective, about the gift of seeing your life from above. Within hours, the post had dozens of comments from women my age who recognized themselves in my story. Women who'd spent decades managing other people's comfort at the expense of their own dreams. Women who were tired of being convenient. The most meaningful comment came from someone named Laura Barnes. This is my grandma, everyone. She's the coolest person I know, and I can't wait to hear about her adventures when she comes home for Christmas. Dad says we're going to have dinner with her if she has time for us. I hope she does. I stared at that comment for a long time, feeling something shift in my chest, like ice breaking up after a long winter. Laura had found my blog, had read my words, had claimed me publicly as someone worth knowing, not as a convenient grandmother, but as a person with her own story worth following. Tomorrow we'd travel to Florence, where I'd help Mrs. Petit navigate the city and watch Mr. Hopkins discover gelato. I'd translate menu items, bandage blisters, and listen to stories about grandchildren back home and lovers lost to time. But tonight, I sat in the gathering darkness of a Tuscan evening, finally understanding what it meant to be home in my own life. The woman who'd opened that Christmas envelope 8 months ago, the one who'd accepted a motel voucher as if she deserved nothing better, felt like someone I'd known once and grown beyond. The revenge, I realized, hadn't been in making Walt sorry. It had been in making myself impossible to dismiss, in becoming someone so fully realized, so clearly valuable, that his opinion of me became irrelevant to my sense of worth. The best revenge, after all, wasn't making them pay for underestimating you. It was proving them wrong. Now tell me, what would you have done if you were in my place? Let me know in the comments. Thank you for watching.